Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Craig Malkin. I'm a clinical psychologist and lecturer for Harvard Medical School, and I'm also the author of Rethinking Narcissism, devoted to helping you understand and cope with narcissism in all its different forms, not just the obvious kinds that you hear about, the loud, brash versions. There's other kinds. I encourage you to look at my other videos if you're interested in hearing more about them. But today, what I wanted to talk about is something that's come up a lot. Many people have written in and asked me, what are the typical effects if I've been raised by a narcissistic parent? So I just wanted to quickly go through some of those, the ones that I see most commonly that we can identify from the research and that tend to come up most frequently. The first is self-blame, chronic self-blame. Let me paint you a picture first. If you have a parent who's extremely narcissistic, who explodes and is triggered by the smallest things, who criticizes you at the drop of a hat, where you just feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells. If you're a child and you feel trapped, you can't really just walk out the door. You don't really have that power. So one way that we empower ourselves is to say, oh, I see, I'm the problem. And it leads to this chronic pattern of self-blame every time things go badly in a relationship. As if it's dangerous to express disappointment or anger to those that we love, even in the smallest way, for the ways that they've hurt us, then we're likely to turn to self-blame. The analogy I often use is one of a dry well. You can think of a well, a relationship kind of like a well. Either it has enough water for you to survive or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, if there's not enough water there, then you might make a trade and tell yourself, oh, it's me. The problem is me. My approach is wrong. I'm going about this stupidly. I have to be more careful in how I approach the well, or I need to drop to my knees and pray to the sky, or I need to decorate the well. You know, all these different ways of going about trying to explain, oh, this is why there's nothing there. And now what you've done is you've traded a sense of hope, or rather, let me say this the other way around. You've traded your self-esteem and a sense of empowerment and confidence for a sense of hope. The problem is me. If it weren't for me, if I weren't constantly screwing up, then I would have what I need here. So one really common outcome is self-blame. Another common outcome of having a narcissistic parent, whether it's a father or a mother, and again, if you picture there are different kinds of narcissism, but one that I want to speak to is if you've been in a relationship with a parent who is either explosive or extremely fragile, where they crumble and say, why you see me as such a bad parent simply because you try to bring something to their attention, then you are apt to develop what in the research and in my writing and Rethinking Narcissism I've come to call echoism. That is a fear of seeming narcissistic in any way, a fear of standing out, a fear of becoming a burden. People who struggle with echoism often struggle not only to have a voice and to be able to voice their own needs, but they also don't much like their needs. They tend to bury them. The idea here is that if I have as little impact as possible on this extremely narcissistic parent, maybe things will go well. As you can imagine, the more sensitive a child is, the more likely they are to tip towards echoism. And this term echoism I developed from the myth of Narcissus and Echo. Echo is the nymph who was cursed to repeat back the last few words that she heard. And like Echo, people who struggle with echoism tend to fall into extremely difficult relationships with often very narcissistic partners. And you can see how this might be patterned after having to cope with a narcissistic parent. Another predictable outcome, number 3 on my list, is insecure attachment. What is insecure attachment? Well, when we feel securely attached, we feel like when we're sad or scared or blue, when we feel vulnerable in any way, we can turn to one special person or persons and trust that they will be there for us, that they will listen to us, and that they will care about what we're going through. In the absence of that, we become insecurely attached. We lack that sense of trust that a person will be there for us. And that can take 2 forms. One form of insecure attachment is anxious attachment. And that's where, sort of out of protest of the lack of connection, you chase after connection, say, why won't you pay attention to me? You might become angry, you might become critical. This doesn't necessarily take the form of extremely narcissistic behavior, but what can happen is that you become sort of aggressively a pursuer of connection. That is insecure, that is anxious attachment. Avoidant attachment is where people kind of give up on looking to somebody to be able to depend on them altogether, and they hold people at arm's lengths. They don't like to be particularly close. They're really cut off from their need to depend on others. Those are the 2 major forms of insecure attachment. It gets more complicated than that, but that's just what I want you to hold on to. So that's really 3 on my list. The 4th that I want you to think about is, and some of these overlap, you can tell, that when you've had an extremely narcissistic parent, precisely because you come to distrust your own needs, you might bury them. And maybe many people who struggle with egoism often bury their needs very deep. But what happens is they reach a point in their life, because we all have these needs. This is part of being a human being. It's not without cost that we wind up burying our needs. So what happens is suddenly the way of living life by trying not to be a burden and maybe always being the empathic caretaker and not taking up too much room doesn't work anymore. You reach a crisis in your life, or you need something more than you have in the past, and suddenly you have what I call a need panic. And that is, the needs are pressing, but they feel so uncomfortable and so scary that the only way to get rid of a need is to get it met right away. So suddenly, whereas in the past you felt yourself to be fairly self-sufficient and again adept at not putting too much on people, now you find yourself in a bit of a disorganized way, wanting contact more often, wanting to call more often. This is what I call a need panic. Number 5 on the list, fierce independence. If you have been raised by an extremely narcissistic parent for whom any kind of need becomes challenging, where they feel like it's disruptive, or they're not sure they can meet it, or they feel or they explode because you try to put some expectations on them, then one way to cope with that, obviously, and you can see how this overlaps with avoidant attachment, is I don't need anything. I don't need anything from anyone, and I don't want to try. I had one client once who struggled so much throughout her life of asking for anything, even people wanting to focus on her birthday. She would sort of push that away. She just didn't want to be put in the position of being reminded that, in fact, she might need things from other people, and she went out of her way to try not to express any needs at all. It's a kind of fierce independence, and what you can think of it as a pushing away of needs. Number 6 on my list of some of the most common outcomes, and again, these kinds of things are particularly the case if you have an extremely abusive parent. Not all people who are extremely narcissistic might resort to outright physical and emotional abuse, like hitting and name calling, or something called gaslighting, where you try to convince the other person there's something wrong with them. Sometimes it takes much subtler forms, but one of the end results is something I called becoming a parentified child. Other people have called it that too. So what I should say is that's just one of the predictable outcomes, becoming a parentified child. And that is where you become extremely adept at mirroring or echoing, going back to that term of echoism, someone's needs. Becomes your stance in a relationship. It's almost as if to connect is to attend to someone else's needs, very often at the expense of your own needs. And in a child, this takes the form of, if I take care of my mother or father enough, if I pay enough attention to them and set myself aside, maybe they'll love me, maybe they won't explode, maybe they won't react this way. When I was growing up, my own mother suffered from migraines. It was unclear if she actually had migraines, but very often she fell into these funks and would sort of lay in the dark. I became her caretaker. I would put I would pat her head with a warm washcloth or to try to help her feel better. And I realized, looking back, that I was terrified of her disappearing into the darkness, and I was trying to keep her from doing that. I didn't want to lose her. And she definitely derived a lot from that. I became a parentified child. The seventh on my list is, not surprisingly, you can become extremely narcissistic. Now, this interacts with temperament. If you have a parent who's loud and bombastic or even abusive, if you've got a strong temperament yourself, and part of temperament is just our biologically inborn tendencies. If you're extroverted by nature, that's how you were born, and or you have more of a tendency towards aggression, you might wind up coping by sort of playing a game of, you can't beat him, join him. I will be the loudest person in the room. Better to be the victimizer than the victim. This is really common with abuse. If someone's going to be in a vulnerable position, it's not going to be me. I'll put you in a vulnerable position. If somebody's going to doubt the clarity of their thinking or think that there's something wrong with them or they're mentally unstable, I'm going to say or do things to make you feel that way. So it's really common when somebody's extremely narcissistic, when they feel very fragile or they feel very anxious, they have a form of mild psychosis called a thought disorder. That's a formal disruption in the quality and content of thinking, and it makes them feel even more vulnerable. This is one of the reasons for gaslighting, where they wind up saying or doing things to make you feel like there's something wrong with your head. So very often somebody with an extremely narcissistic parent, that person might be sort of fraying around the edges, and they wind up modeling this behavior where, I don't know what's wrong with you. I don't know why you would behave this way. If they get upset over the way they're being treated, or I'm going to send you to a psychiatrist. There must be something wrong with you. Very often when people have had extremely narcissistic parents, they wind up developing these patterns themselves if they have that stronger temperament. It's more likely that someone is going to develop egoism if, say, they're more sensitive, they tend to be more emotionally in tuned. Again, they can become empathic caretakers. Or if they're highly sensitive persons, people who feel things very deeply and even experience physical sensations more intensely. You can look up Highly Sensitive Persons by Ellen Aron if you're not familiar with her research. These are people who are more likely to respond to the narcissistic parenting by tipping into egoism. Let's talk about the eighth common outcome of having a narcissistic parent, because very often parents who are narcissistic are so narcissistic they become abusive, and I've talked about that in other videos, where your parent hits you, throws things at you, bruises you, outright physical abuse. emotional abuse, where they put you down, are constantly critical, may gaslight you, that is, say and do things to make you feel like there's something going wrong with your mind and play with your sense of reality. When you've experienced things like this in a relationship with a parent, it is not uncommon for people to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So briefly, let me say what that is and just touch on it. I can give you an overview. The first criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder is the trauma itself, that is, the experience of the abuse. The second criteria is what's called re-experiencing symptoms. That is things like flashbacks, nightmares, feeling like you've going through the upsetting event all over again, and it can happen where you're just sitting around relaxing and suddenly you are feeling like you're back in the situation where you're being horribly abused. The third criteria is something called avoidance. That is, avoidance of all thoughts, feelings, or reminders of the original trauma. So you don't watch movies that involve abusive parents. You won't read about difficult relationships. More insidiously, very often, if somebody has had a lot of abuse in their childhood, they develop emotional numbing, emotional avoidance. That is, where they're cut off from their feelings. It almost becomes dangerous to feel. It's as if to feel vulnerable is dangerous itself. So feelings become avoided altogether. And the fourth main criteria involve hypervigilance, hyperarousal. That is, feeling constantly on edge, jumpy, having anxiety. You might have difficulty sleeping, irritability. All of these things are really common. The other one that I want to point out, because this is particularly common with prolonged abuse, is what's called a foreshortened sense of future. That one of the outcomes appears to be this inability to really see into the future and think, okay, I have a life ahead of me. It can take the form of suicidal thinking too, suicidal thoughts, and even ideas, but there's just this general sense that there is no real future. Obviously, that's a horrible effect, a horrible outcome from abuse. But so I just wanted to, even though I've talked about that in other videos of mine, I wanted to say a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. So in that sense, there's really, I've touched on 8 common effects of narcissistic parenting. I hope you found this helpful. I will talk in future about maybe some ways to cope with this, cope with having had a narcissistic parent, however it's affected you. But I just wanted to go through this briefly. If you like my video and you like my videos, please click like and share and do subscribe, because I plan more videos. I'm really trying to put out there information, not just that's clear information from clinical research, that is working with people in the room as a therapist. There's research on that, but much of what I'm telling you about is straight out of the research too, on what drives narcissism and what is the nature of narcissistic personality disorder. And I'm trying to make that as clear as possible and to provide some accurate information. I think there's a shortage of psychologists and doctors who are, sorry for the screen dim there, I hope that didn't show up, but there is a shortage of psychologists and doctors who are talking about this, so I'm trying to fill that gap. So again, please click like if you like the video. If you want to see more, feel free to comment so that I can respond to your comments. Questions often lead to further discussion and further videos, and I look forward to seeing you again. And if you really like this and you want to read more, I encourage you to read Rethinking Narcissism. I go over in so much detail many of these ideas, and I go into further depth. So again, thank you so much for watching. I'm Dr. Craig Malkin, author of Rethinking Narcissism. Take care.